Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us for our Sunday morning study. We're going to be going through one of the theological themes and images of the Bible. That's the current series that we're in, and we're going to be looking at the idea of covenant in the Bible. And it's very interesting that covenant is such a huge part of Scripture. In fact, it's probably not an exaggeration to say that you really can't understand the Bible and really understand what God is about in the Bible until you really start to understand this idea of covenant. Now, it's important for us to see that, like pretty much everything else, God has created a world for us to see, and this world that He has created has certain characteristics that are similar to the way that God is. We really can understand our relationship with God because there are all kinds of things around us that are examples of our relationship with God, that there are metaphors scattered throughout creation, and God will use those as opportunities to teach us about Him and about our relationship with Him. And one of those big metaphors that happens all throughout life is the idea of covenant. You really are in more covenants than you understand. Basically, anytime there's a unity created between two things, anytime one thing can represent another, then you have some form of covenant. Now, some covenants are very strong and some covenants are very weak. But all of them have things that they can teach us about our relationship with God. So it's important for us to understand how the Bible uses this idea of covenant and what it teaches us through that about our relationship with God. Now, as we get into this, it's important for us to see that there are a number of covenants throughout the Bible. There's not just one. There are numerous covenants throughout the Bible. And so we'll look at a few of those covenants to begin with and see that God makes deals or covenants, agreements with humanity throughout Old Testament history. And that in doing that, God is not just, it's not the kind of deal where, I'm at the ballpark and somebody, there's a guy selling hot dogs and I give him $5 and he gives me a hot dog. That's not the kind of deal that we're talking about. What we're talking about in the kind of deals that God makes in covenants is that God here is making the kind of deal where He's defining the parameters of relationship and unity that He has with us. That's the kind of deal we should be thinking about. So not so much the idea of just, I go down to the store and to the car dealership and I give them $40,000 and they give me a truck and, we hash out the deals. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the kind of deal where God it's almost like an employment contract, something like that, because in an employment contract, you're going to represent the company and the company's going to represent you. Or even better, a marriage contract, because in a marriage, what's happening is two are becoming one. That's the kind of deals that we're talking about. So let's look at Genesis chapter 1, because really this starts very early on. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 30 says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God He created them, male and female He created them. God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground.' Then God said, 'I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food.' And so it was so." So what do we see here? First of all, there's repetition here. There's always repetition, because the issue is that things are always determined by at least two witnesses. And so first we have this conversation. It says God said, "Let us make mankind in our image." So we don't know who's involved in this conversation. Now, theologians basically look at two different scenarios for this conversation. It's either a conversation between the Trinity, that God is having this conversation amongst God, amongst the different members of the Trinity, or that there's a godly council. There's other spiritual beings in heaven that God is saying this to. So we're not going to get into which of those views is correct, because it's not really that important for what we're talking about here. The point here is that the first issue here is a conversation. And this conversation means that God this isn't just happenstance, a byproduct that he happened to create something and this is the way that it turned out. There's always unforeseen consequences in that God said, well, I'll just make some people, and this just happened to be the way that it turned out. That's not the way that we should see this. The reason that we're being given this information is that God is actually planning this ahead of time, that this is actually something that is happening by design. So by design, God is saying, we're going to make man in our image. So the thing is, there's implied covenant here from the very start. There's going to be a relationship, there's going to be a unity, and that's actually at the heart of who we are as human beings. That's super important for us to understand, that this idea of covenant with God isn't just a byproduct, and he said, hey, well, there's some people there, why don't I strike up a friendship with them? That's not the way it is. From the very beginning, there's covenantal unity here between us and God, because he's created us to be in his likeness. Now, theologians have also argued a lot about what it means to be in the likeness or image of God, and they've come up with numerous things: the ability to have language, the ability to have rational thought, and sometimes people will say those two things are the same thing. There's a whole bunch of things that through time theologians have said. But one of the things that's fascinating here is that what could be at the heart of this is just the idea of what an image does. It's not so much that God here, in saying that we are being made in his image, is talking about the specific elements that we are similar to him in. It's really possible here that what God is saying here is what's really defining and really important here at this stage, is to understand that there's a relationship here between me and them. So what I mean by that is this: you have to think about what an image is. So say you have a dog, you draw a picture of a dog. It's not so much important. What makes that thing an image or a picture is not the fact that your dog has big ears and the picture has big ears. You don't look at that picture and say, well, let's see if it really is an image, and we'll see, it's an image if they have big ears or they have big feet or whatever. That's not what's at issue here. The issue is that what makes the image an image is that there's a relationship between it and what it images. So, for instance, you can think about modern art. Think about Picasso, and he would draw people, and they're all cubed and everything else. And if you wanted to say, well, what's the significance or what is exactly the same about this picture and the person? So if we sat down and we watched Picasso paint the picture, and we also looked at the person he was painting, it's not like we could say, well, the person's head is round and Picasso's person's head is round, because probably wouldn't be round. It'd probably be a cube. Or, we couldn't, there's not one specific thing we could point to on that person and say, aha, this is a picture of that person. Because really what Picasso was painting was, he was painting something like, the impression of this person, or a subjective feeling about what this person represents to him. The point is, there is still a relationship between the thing that is imaged and the imager, the image and the thing that is imaged. So that's the important thing to understand here, is that when it's entirely possible that when it says that we are made in the image of God, what's at heart here is the relationship between an image and what it images. So let's go ahead and move along. So it says after that, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals. So inherent in this imaging of God is that we are going to rule. Why? Because God rules, and we image God, so we are going to rule as well. And so it's fundamental. It's a fundamental aspect of who we are. It's part of the covenant that we rule over these things. Now, people will say that we shouldn't rule over these things, or we shouldn't see that we need to live in harmony with them. But then it will define what that harmony should look like and what we should do in order to do that. It's interesting that there really isn't a way for us to live in existence with the animals, the birds and the livestock and all that kind of stuff without exercising dominion over them. Because we have the ability to define what our relationship to them will be, and they don't have that same ability. And so then it moves on, verse 27, God created man in his own image, and if we move down to verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, and again, rule over these things. So filling the earth, subduing it, all these things are part of this first initial covenant that's in the Bible. And this is a very important covenant, that we understand that God has made this deal with us and that we image who he is. So in Genesis chapter 3, we have the fall. And what the thing that's really fascinating in the Bible is that whenever you have a covenant get broken in the Bible, then it has to be replaced with something else. And we see here that mankind doesn't live up to his covenant with God in Genesis chapter 3. He doesn't do it. He disobeys God. He doesn't take dominion over the animals. He doesn't guard and protect the garden. All these things that he's called to, he doesn't do. So the result of that, starting in verse 16, is that he makes a new covenant with man. And this new covenant is not a great one, because it says to the woman in verse 16, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband. He will rule over you. To Adam he says, because you listened to your wife and ate from the fruit of the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until they turn to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, to dust you return. So what happens here is that you notice that the original terms of the covenant have now been cursed. So all these curses that are going along with this have to do with the idea of what God set up the original covenant to be. Remember that they were to rule over all these things. They were to rule over the ground and have the plants for food. Adam and Eve were to have a covenant with one another. She was to be his helpmate, and they were to have this covenant of unity that would result in children, all these things. And these are exactly the things that then get cursed. Because what's happened is, by disobeying God and not fulfilling the covenant, the terms of the covenant turn into something like poison. That everything that they're supposed to be and do, it's not that those things just disappear and you go, oh, well, I'm not in the covenant anymore. That's not how it works. It's that those things get poisoned. And so that's kind of how we should probably understand this. And this poisoning is kind of a new covenant. It's a new relationship, a new imaging between God and man. Now in Genesis chapter 8 and 9, we have another covenant that takes place here. And what happens is, remember that mankind continues to sin, and so God is not going to continue to deal with that, and so he sends a flood, and he deals with Noah then. And Noah and his family are in the ark, and they get through the flood, and then afterward, what happens is Noah and his family come safely to dry land, and God renews the covenant. And in verse 4 it says, you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. Well, this is a new thing, because previously in Genesis, mankind wasn't supposed to eat meat. Now they can. Verse 5, and for your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, from each human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. So what's interesting is you have a couple things happening. You have a transformation of the covenant, and you have a couple of things added that are very fascinating. First of all, remember that originally in the garden, God gave every plant for food. Now he's giving animals for food, and he's saying to Adam that you have to take the life of any animal or any human who takes the life of a human being, because a human is in the image of God. So what's happening there? Well, it's very interesting. Notice that this ends in a couple of things. Number one, it ends in, for in the image of God has God made mankind. Remember, mankind images God. Well, what has God just done? God has, through the flood, he has punished sins, and this includes, Cain and Abel, all the murders that happened after that, all the evil. He's punished sin by taking the life of animals and man. And now, because we image God, we are given the covenant of doing the very same thing ourselves. That if we have to restrain evil by taking life, that's the way that God has done it. And also notice in verse 7, it says, as for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. So the original terms of the covenant are still there, but something has been added to it. And again, because we image God, that's the reason. And this imaging God is really shorthand for covenant. There's a relationship of unity between us and God. So Genesis chapter 12 and 15, God creates a covenant with with Abraham. And remember, it's important to see exactly what's happening from a big picture perspective here, that mankind has been drifting away from God. We're not imaging God. We're not unified with God. We're not acting the way that God would act. And this happened all through the pre-Noah time. And then God brought the flood and kind of reset things, but now it's happening once again. So now God is not going to deal with this the same way that he dealt with it last time. He's going to deal with it a new way. And this way, what he's going to do is he's going to make a covenant with Abraham, and Abraham's job is going to be to have this covenant of unity with God. He's supposed to image God. God's going to be for Abraham, and Abraham's going to be for God, and the whole world's going to be blessed through it. So this first starts in chapter 12, where God says to Abraham, hey, here's the deal. Come along and go where I'm going, and leave your old life behind and follow me. And what happens is that Abraham has this opportunity then to go ahead and do that. He has the opportunity to follow God, and he does. The problem is that he doesn't seem to be getting any closer to having a family, to having offspring, all the things that God promised him in Genesis chapter 12. And it says, after this, chapter 15, verse 1, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abraham said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abraham said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. So God had promised him that if we have this covenant arrangement, I'm going to make you like into this great nation. It's going to be fantastic. And Abraham's saying, well, this isn't happening. So remember that God then he takes Abraham and he has him cut these animals in half, and then he passes between the halves as a flaming pillar and a smoking pot. And what's happening is God is taking on this covenant, and in taking on this covenant, what God is doing, you cut an animal in half, and then there's blood in the middle, and that blood is what you would walk through when you made a covenant in the Old Testament. And then that blood that would get on you is called the blood of the covenant. And the idea here is that you're making a whole out of two parts. And so what's the penalty for trying to break this thing apart? Well, when you break an animal apart, what happens? It dies, and you get blood all over it. Well, once you've made this covenant, what's going to happen if you break it? You're going to die. That's kind of the idea behind this. And so God is saying, I'm going to take that penalty for the breaking of this covenant on myself. And Abraham doesn't walk through the pieces, only God does. So once again, there's this covenant relationship that God develops with Abraham. Then you can go on to Exodus chapter 20. And in Exodus chapter 20, God expands this covenant, and he's making it with all of the nation of Israel, and he's telling them a few things that they're going to have to do. He's saying, look, I'm going to be your God, you're going to be my people, and what does this mean? What does this mean for you to image me? Well, he gives them the 10 commandments, and that's what Exodus 20 does. He gives them the 10 commandments. Now the question is why? Why those commandments, and why does he give them these things? Well, it has to do with the character and nature of God. The commandments reflect the idea of the character and nature of God. God is giving them clues to his character. When he says things like, don't commit adultery, it's because he's faithful. When he says things like, do not lie, it's because God is truth. So God is giving them kind of the characteristics of who he is, and then saying that's who you have to be because you're going to image me. That's what it means to be a covenant. We can go on. 2 Samuel chapter 7, God has a covenant with David, and he says, somebody from your house is always going to be on the throne. And then we can go even further to Matthew chapter 26, verse 28. And in this, Jesus, at the end of his life, right before he's crucified, at the Last Supper, he's having that meal with his disciples, and he has the wine and the bread, and he says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. So when Jesus has these elements of communion, he's saying, this is the blood of the covenant. There's a new covenant, and this new covenant is represented in communion, and this wine that he takes, that we all share in, is going to be the blood of the covenant. So what Jesus is saying is that Jesus is taking on the covenant. He's taking on the burdens of the covenant. He's taking on the provisions of the covenant. Jesus in his life is living in such a way that he fulfills the covenant, and then in his death, he's taking on our lack of fulfillment of the covenant. And so we can then be found in a covenant with Christ, who has fulfilled the law for us and taken our punishment, so that we can be seated with Christ at the right hand of God, because there's this unity between us. Now, it's important for us to understand that there's various elements of a covenant in the Old Testament times, and these are important for us because once we understand them, then a lot of the scriptures in the New Testament make a lot more sense. So one of the things that they would do in the Old Testament, if they were making a covenant, is that there would be an exchange of clothes. So you would exchange an article of clothing with the person that you were making a covenant with. Now, why would you do that? Well, remember that clothing represents identity, and so if you exchange clothing with somebody, then you're basically exchanging who you are, exchanging identities with them. You're becoming them, they're becoming you. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us in the modern world, but remember back then you didn't have all kinds of clothes. So if you exchanged an article of clothing and you were walking around, people would go, hey, isn't that Tom's hat? Isn't that Tom's shirt? Isn't that Mary's dress? You only had one set, so people came to associate you with those clothes. And so once you exchanged them, they'd say, hey, isn't that? Well, yeah, we made a covenant. Okay, that's the way that it kind of works. So how does that help us look at the New Testament differently? Well, in Philippians chapter 2, verse 7 through 8, It says, rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. The idea here is Jesus took on our clothing of humanity. And so he identified with us. He identified with us, and so by doing that, he identified even with us to the point of death. He's saying, hey, I'm going to take on them, and they die, well, therefore I will die. So he's taking on us. Now, there's another part of that that's important for us to understand. And that is in Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 and 27. It says, so in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. So Jesus takes on our humanity, and we take on his being a child of God. We take on his sonship. We put on his identity. And so there's an exchange there that goes on, and obviously that's to be hugely in our favor. It'd be like, if you got to, let's say there's a famous actor, let's say, there's Tom Selleck or somebody like that, and they say, well, hey, I'll go work your job today, and you can go work my job, and you were able to exchange clothing, and somehow people thought that you were him, and so you got treated like him all day, and he got treated like you all day. Well, it'd probably go pretty good for you, That's kind of the way that this is that we've taken on, he's taken on our clothing, we've taken on his. So that's kind of what would happen. And so all the times in the New Testament where it talks about clothing yourself with Christ, you have to understand that that's putting on his identity. Now there's another aspect to this, and that is there's an exchange of belts. And what that meant was strength. So back in the ancient world, there was this understanding that kind of your strength came from your core, right? Because your core is what attaches the bottom half of you that's kind of planted in the earth to the top half of you that's doing the work, right? So if you're swinging a scythe or you're pushing a plow or you're whatever it is that you're doing, you're operating it with your upper body. But the only way that you have any purchase is through your lower body. So your lower body has to be planted to the earth, and then your upper body has to be doing it, whatever it is you're doing. Well, there's got to be something to connect that. That connection is vital. Well, that's your core. And the idea is that the belt then came to represent the core. It came to represent the strength of that place where these two things are connected. And so there was an exchange that would happen in the ancient world when you made a covenant, is you would exchange belts with the person, and it means exchanging strength. So in Numbers 11:17, it says, I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take some of the power of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them. They will share the burden of the people with you so that you will not have to carry it alone. So what's happening here is there's a spirit that God has given, and he's given it to Moses here. And in giving this spirit to Moses, he's allowed Moses to be able to lead the people, to have discernment and to solve problems. And now he's going to give some of that strength, some of that spirit to other people so that they can be helpful in doing this. Now, we can also look at Judges chapter 14, verse 6. It says, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. So the idea is the Spirit of the Lord, the power of God comes on this person, and you know who this is. This is Samson. And he's able to tear this lion apart with his bare hands. And why? Because he has the strength and the power of God. So the idea is that, I'm giving God my strength and he's giving me his. And so there's a great truth there for us to explore. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can look at in just that one article of clothing, that one exchange that takes place. And lastly for today, there's an exchange of weapons. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 26 through 37, what happens is that if you recall, there's a problem, and the problem is that there's a battle going on, and the battle is important because David is going to get involved in this battle. There's a guy named Goliath who has come out and he's challenging the armies of God, and David comes out and he says, who is this that dares to defy the armies of the living God? And nobody's doing anything about it. So David says, well, this guy's defying God. Well, I'm after him. Now, has Goliath ever done anything to David? Well, no. But David is living in a covenant relationship with God. And so this guy is defying the armies of the living God. This guy is God's enemy. Well, now he's David's enemy. That's what happens when you're in a covenant. All right. And finally, we're going to look at Exodus chapter 23, verse 22. It says, if you listen carefully to what he says and do all that I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and will oppose those who oppose you. That's covenant. Now, the question is, why this exchange? Why exchange of identity, strength, and enemies? Well, because what you're doing is you're connecting yourself to somebody. So if they have an enemy, you have an enemy. Your strength is going to be used for them. Their strength is going to be used for you. And you see them and you as tied together. So those are aspects of the covenant that are very important. Now we're going to continue on with this study because there's much more to this. And what we'll see is that by understanding this, you're going to start to understand exactly the relationship you have with God and how powerful that is. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.